Paige Bergfeld. On July 1st, 2007, around 10 at night, someone driving through an empty parking lot in Grand Junction, Colorado, noticed a red Ford Focus engulfed in flames. By the time firefighters put it out, the car was gutted. It belonged to a 34-year-old mother of three named Paige Bergfeld, and she had already been missing for 3 days. Her 8-year-old daughter had been the one to tell authorities that her mom never came home. And over the next several weeks, as investigators began retracing Paige's life, they discovered something that no one in her circle had suspected. The woman everyone thought they knew had been living 2 very different lives at the same time. To the parents at her toddler dance class and the customers who bought Pampered Chef kitchen products from her, Paige was a devoted soccer mom, twice divorced, raising 3 kids on her own in a quiet Colorado city. But when detectives pulled her phone records and combed through her computer, they found something else. Paige had been running an escort service called Models Inc. under the alias Carrie. She had a roster of clients, a second phone, and a carefully maintained wall between the 2 halves of her existence. That wall made the investigation almost impossible to run. Both of her ex-husbands, Ron Biegler and Rob Dixon, had to be looked at. So did a long list of men who had used her services. Detectives were swimming in leads that went nowhere until one name kept floating to the surface. Lester Ralph Jones, a mechanic who worked at an RV dealership and had been one of Paige's clients. Jones had a violent past. He had already served 5 years in prison for first-degree assault and the attempted kidnapping of his own ex-wife. But there was a problem. Without a body, the case stalled. Months became years, and the Bergfeld family was left waiting. Then on March 6th, 2012, almost 5 years after Paige disappeared, a pair of hikers walking through Wells Gulch in Delta County, about 30 miles southeast of Grand Junction, came across skeletal remains in the brush. Dental records confirmed it was Paige. Duct tape was wrapped around her skull and jawbone. Whatever had been done to her, the decomposition was so advanced that a precise cause of death could never be determined. Investigators went back to Lester Jones with fresh eyes. Cell phone records showed he had been in contact with Paige in the hours before she vanished. Police dogs trained in scent detection were brought to her burned-out car, and they hit on Jones's scent inside the vehicle. And then there was the gas can. It was found sitting near his work desk at the RV dealership, the same dealership that sat diagonally across the parking lot from the spot where the Focus had been set on fire. So how does a man with a documented history of violence against women stay free long enough to take another life? Jones was charged in November of 2014. His first trial in 2016 ended in a hung jury and a mistrial. But prosecutors were not done. They tried him again, and on December 27, 2016, a jury found Lester Ralph Jones guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and second-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 12 years for the kidnapping. In 2022, the Colorado Court of Appeals merged the kidnapping conviction into the felony murder charge, but left the life sentence exactly where it was. Paige Bergfeld's case drew coverage from 48 Hours, Dateline, and 2020, largely because of the double life angle. But what tends to get lost in the headlines is the simplest part of the story. A woman with a violent client needed help. Nobody saw the danger until it was too late. Her remains lay in a Colorado ravine for nearly 5 years before anyone found them. As of 2026, Jones is serving his life sentence at Fremont Correctional Facility in Canyon City, Colorado. Paige Bergfeld was taken by someone on the margins of her life, a client with a record that told the whole story. But in the case that follows, the threat was not an outsider. It was the person sleeping in the same bed. Deanne Warner. On the evening of April 25, 2021, Deanne Warner walked through her farmhouse on Munger Road in Franklin Township, Michigan, and was never seen alive again. She was 52 years old, married to a farmer named Dale John Warner, and the two of them had been fighting about money. The day before she vanished, Dale, and several farm workers had gotten into a heated argument over the finances of the operation. When Dee did not turn up the following day, her children wanted to call the police right away. Dale did not. That reluctance was the first red flag, and it would not be the last. The Lenawee County Sheriff's Office opened an investigation with help from the FBI, and by 2022, the Michigan State Police had taken over. What they found was a marriage that had turned poisonous long before Dee disappeared. Dale had placed a tracking device inside Dee's Hummer. He had installed an app to monitor the movements of her Cadillac. Witnesses described a man who watched his wife's every move and made sure she knew it. But watching was one thing. Proving what had happened to Dee was another. Dale refused to let drones fly over the property and revoked consent for police to search the farm. For more than 3 years, investigators believed Dee was dead, but could not find her. The break came on August 16th and 17th of 2024, when Michigan State Police executed a search warrant on the Warner farm and seized an anhydrous ammonia tank, the kind used to store liquid fertilizer. When they opened it, they found Deanne Warner's remains wrapped in a tarp and bound with duct tape. Someone had written a tag by hand and attached it to the tank. It read "out of service" and "do not fill." An autopsy performed by Dr. Patrick Cho, a deputy medical examiner out of Oakland County, determined that Dee had been strangled and beaten. She had blunt force trauma to her head and face, with bruises on her temples and the back of her skull. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. But what sealed the case were the digital breadcrumbs Dale had left behind. Surveillance and drone footage captured him using a front-end loader to move the ammonia tank into a spray barn after he learned that cadaver dogs were coming to the property. Investigators pulled his search history and found queries for chemical cremation, what liquid cremation is and why it is illegal, how to dispose of a large propane tank, and, in a detail that prosecutors would hammer home at trial, widower dating sites. The most damaging piece of evidence was a recorded jail call. After the tank was seized, Dale phoned his son and asked whether the one they took was the one we painted and put decals on. What kind of person searches for widower dating sites while his wife's body is still hidden on his own property? Dale Warner was charged in November of 2023. His trial began on February 12, 2026, and on March 10th, a jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for roughly 9 hours over 2 days before finding him guilty of second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. On May 7, 2026, Judge Michael Olsaver sentenced Dale Warner to 60 years for the crime and 10 consecutive years for tampering, 70 years total. He will be eligible for parole in about 33 years, at which point he will be in his 90s. Dee's brother, Greg Hardy, had spent years running a Justice for Dee campaign. Prosecutor Jackie Wise told the jury that Dale could have called 911 and admitted what he had done. But instead he taped Dee's mouth and nose shut. And every one of those steps was a conscious decision. Family members at sentencing called him a spineless piece of human debris, A Help Dale Find D billboard that he had put up himself became one of the bitter details of the case. A man publicly pretending to search for the woman he had concealed on his own farm. As of May 2026, Dale Warner is incarcerated in Michigan. Dale Warner hid what he did for more than 3 years. The man at the center of the next case managed to hide it for 25, until a former associate finally told the police exactly where to look. Kimberly Langwell. In the summer of 1999, a 15-year-old girl named Tiffany sat in her house in Beaumont, Texas, waiting for her mother to come pick her up for dinner. Her mother was Kimberly Langwell, 34, a secretary at a mobile oil refinery. Kimberly had called earlier that day to say she was making a quick stop at her ex-boyfriend Terry Rose's house to help him with some repairs. She would be there and back in no time. That was July 9th. Kimberly never showed up. Within days, searchers found her silver 1994 Nissan Altima sitting in the parking lot of a shopping center at the corner of Dowlin Road and Phelan Boulevard, outside what was then an Eckerd drugstore. Her purse was still inside. Her keys were still in the car. There was no sign of a struggle. It was as if she had simply stopped existing between the moment she parked and the moment someone noticed the car sitting there. Detectives in Beaumont started working through the men in Kimberly's life. There was a boyfriend and coworker named Ken Weatherford. There was a former supervisor at the refinery named Frank McCormick, who was eventually cleared with a grocery store receipt that placed him somewhere else. But the name that kept coming up was Terry Rose, the ex-boyfriend, the last known person she planned to see that day. A friend of Kimberly's told investigators that Kim had once confided she was afraid of Rose, that she believed if she ever tried to leave him for good, he would end her life. Rose stayed at the top of the suspect list, but without a body or physical evidence tying him to a crime, the case went cold. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. Tiffany grew up without her mother, and the Beaumont Police Department kept the file open, but had nowhere to go. Then, in April of 2024, 25 years after Kimberly vanished, an informant walked into the police department and changed everything. His name was David Wiley, a former tow truck driver who had once worked for Rose. Wiley told detectives that Rose had confessed years earlier. According to Wiley, Rose admitted that he had taken Kimberly's life inside his home on Lindbergh Drive on the very day she disappeared. He said Rose had shot her in the back of the head and buried her body under the floor of a bedroom, beneath a concrete slab. How does a person live for a quarter of a century directly above the remains of someone they harmed? Beaumont Police Detective Heather Wilson assembled a team that included the FBI, the ATF, the volunteer search organization Texas EquuSearch led by Tim Miller, and specialists with ground-penetrating radar. They went to the house on Lindbergh Drive and started scanning beneath the floor. On June 13, 2024, they found what they were looking for. Human remains wrapped in a blanket were exhumed from beneath the bedroom slab. Testing confirmed they were Kimberly Langwell's. Terry Rose, 68 years old at the time, was arrested and charged. On December 2, 2025, he pleaded guilty. 2 weeks later, on December 16th, Judge Raquel West imposed the maximum sentence allowable under the plea agreement, 40 years. Rose must serve at least half of that before he becomes eligible for parole, which means he would be roughly 88 years old. Judge West made her feelings clear when she told him that if the law allowed 50 years, she would give him 50, and if it allowed 60, she would give him 60. Jail calls recorded after his arrest revealed a man with no visible remorse. Rose reportedly blamed it on a bad day and made a vile threat directed at Kimberly's daughter. Tiffany, now an adult named Tiffany McInnes, filed a wrongful death suit and testified at his sentencing. She told the court that his bad day had cost her everything. The case was featured on Oxygen's Cold Justice and CBS's 48 Hours. As of late 2025, Rose is serving his sentence in Texas. For 25 years, Kimberly Langwell lay beneath the floor of the home belonging to the man who took her life, while her daughter grew up never knowing what had happened. What happened to Kimberly was over in a single evening. The woman in the next case endured something that lasted more than 7 years, and the details of her captivity rank among the worst the FBI has ever documented. Colleen Stan. On May 19, 1977, a 20-year-old woman named Colleen Stan stuck out her thumb on the side of Interstate 5 near Red Bluff, California. She was hitchhiking from Eugene, Oregon to a friend's birthday party in Westwood. Several cars had already stopped, and she had waved them off because something about the drivers did not sit right. Then a van pulled over. Inside was a young couple and their baby girl in the back seat. Colleen looked at the baby, decided this ride was safe, and climbed in. The driver was Cameron Hooker. The woman beside him was his wife, Janice. They had not been driving long before Cameron pulled a knife. He forced a homemade wooden box over Colleen's head, a contraption that weighed roughly 20 pounds and blocked all light and sound, and told her that if she screamed, she would die. In those first minutes, Colleen later said, she believed that was exactly what was about to happen. What followed was 7 years of captivity that the FBI would later describe as virtually without precedent. Cameron and Janice Hooker brought Colleen to their home in Red Bluff and turned her into a prisoner. She was kept bound, whipped, hung from the rafters, shocked with electricity, and burned. For up to 23 hours a day, she was locked inside a coffin-like wooden box stored beneath the couple's waterbed. In January of 1978, Cameron forced Colleen to sign a document he called a slavery contract. He renamed her Kay. And to keep her from running, he invented a shadowy organization he called the Company, a group he claimed was always watching and would harm Colleen and her entire family if she ever tried to escape or tell anyone what was happening. The fiction was so convincing that in 1981, 4 years into her captivity, Cameron actually drove Colleen to visit her own family. She spent the night at their home. They took a photograph together, everyone smiling. And she said nothing about what was being done to her, because she believed the company would come for them all if she did. Cameron assaulted Colleen repeatedly throughout her captivity and controlled every aspect of her existence with a level of psychological manipulation that experts would later struggle to explain to a jury. It was not until August of 1984 that the lie finally collapsed. Janice Hooker, who had participated in and witnessed the abuse for years, told Colleen the truth. That the company did not exist, that there was no one watching, that it had all been invented by Cameron to keep her terrified and compliant. Colleen left. She walked out of that house and went home. She celebrates August 10th, 1984 as her escape day. But at first, nothing happened to Cameron Hooker. Janice had begged Colleen not to go to the police, and for a brief time, she did not. That changed on November 7th, 1984, when Janice went to Detective Al Shamblin of the Red Bluff Police Department through her pastor and reported everything. Cameron was arrested that month. How does a person survive 7 years in a box and still walk out with their mind intact? Janice received full immunity in exchange for her testimony. On October 31st, 1985, Cameron Hooker was convicted of kidnapping, rape, sodomy, and multiple related charges. The sentencing judge called him the most dangerous psychopath he had ever encountered and imposed a sentence of 104 years. It seemed like the end of the story, but it was not. Hooker became eligible for parole under California's elderly parole provisions and good time credits, and around 2021, he was reportedly granted release. To block him from ever walking free, the state of California filed a civil commitment petition classifying him as a sexually violent predator. After years of delays, jury selection began in mid-May of 2026. On June 11, 2026, a San Mateo County jury confirmed the designation. He was committed indefinitely to a state hospital facility. Officials in Tehama County expect that commitment to keep him confined for the rest of his life. As of June 2026, Cameron Hooker, now 72, remains in state custody. Colleen Stan survived something that should have been unsurvivable. She outlasted a man who spent 7 years trying to erase her identity. But not every case of a missing woman ends with the victim walking out alive. Some end with remains washing ashore and a husband whose lies had already unraveled long before anyone found the body. Laci Peterson. On the morning of December 24, 2002, Scott Peterson told his wife Laci that he was going fishing. Laci was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant with their son, a boy they had already decided to name Connor. The couple lived in Modesto, California, and by all appearances, their life was comfortable and unremarkable. Scott said he was heading to the Berkeley Marina, about 90 miles away, to take his boat out on the San Francisco Bay. When he came home that evening, Laci was gone. Her stepfather reported her missing, and within hours, the search was on. It became one of the most heavily covered missing person cases in American history. Volunteers fanned out across Modesto. Laci's face was everywhere, on news broadcasts, on flyers, at candlelight vigils across the city. The Peterson family and the Rocha family, Laci's relatives, stood side by side and pleaded for her safe return. And for a while, Scott stood with them, playing the role of the desperate husband convincingly enough that most people believed him. Then the cracks started to show. Investigators discovered that Scott had been having an affair with a massage therapist named Amber Frey. When Frey learned Laci was missing, she contacted police and agreed to record her phone calls with Scott. Those recordings became some of the most damning evidence in the case. In one call, made while the entire country was searching for his pregnant wife, Scott told Amber he was calling from Paris. He was not in Paris. He was in Modesto at a candlelight vigil for Laci. On April 13, 2003, a badly decomposed fetus washed ashore along the San Francisco Bay near Point Isabel in Richmond, California. The next day, a female torso was found about a mile away. DNA testing on April 18th confirmed what Laci's family had feared from the beginning. The remains belonged to Laci and Connor Peterson. They had surfaced just miles from the spot where Scott said he had gone fishing on Christmas Eve. Scott was arrested on April 18, 2003, at a golf course in San Diego. He had dyed his hair blonde and grown a goatee. He was carrying his brother's identification, nearly $15,000 in cash, and camping gear. He was 90 miles from the Mexican border. If the man had nothing to hide, why was he 90 miles from Mexico with a fake identity and $15,000 in cash? The trial was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors had no weapon, no eyewitness, and no confession. But they laid out a portrait of a man who had lied about everything. The fishing trip to the exact body of water where his wife and son would later wash up. The affair he concealed from everyone. The way he told his girlfriend he had lost his wife before Lacey was even reported missing. The cash, the changed appearance, and the proximity to the border when he was picked up. Taken individually, each detail had an innocent explanation. Together, they painted a picture the jury could not ignore. On November 12, 2004, Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder for Lacey's death and second-degree murder for the death of Connor. The judge imposed a death sentence on March 16, 2005. In August of 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned that sentence on the grounds of a juror selection error, and on December 8, 2021, he was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Los Angeles Innocence Project took up his case in 2023, filing petitions and requesting DNA testing. A habeas petition filed June 2, 2025 was denied. Lacey and Connor's deaths had one lasting legal consequence beyond the conviction. Their case helped push Congress to pass the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, signed into law on April 1, 2004. It is still known informally as Lacey and Connor's Law. Both are buried under the surname Rocha, at the request of Lacey's family. A quiet, permanent act of separation from the men who took their lives. As of 2026, Scott Peterson remains incarcerated in California, and his legal challenges continue to be denied. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Natalee Holloway. On the night of May 29, 2005, an 18-year-old honors student from Mountain Brook, Alabama, walked out of a nightclub in Aruba and was never seen again. Her name was Natalee Holloway. She was 5 days into a graduation trip with 124 classmates and 7 chaperones. She had finished high school near the top of her class and had a full scholarship awaiting for her at the University of Alabama, where she planned to study pre-med. She was 18 years old, and by every measure, her life was just getting started. And somewhere between the doors of a nightclub called Carlos and Charlie's in Oranjestad and the hotel where she was supposed to sleep that night, her life ended on a beach in the Caribbean. Witnesses said Natalee left the nightclub around 1:30 in the morning on May 30th with 3 local men. A 17-year-old Dutch national named Joran van der Sloot and 2 Surinamese brothers, Deepak and Satish Kalpo, aged 21 and 18. When questioned, all 3 told police they had simply driven Natalee to her hotel and dropped her off. She missed her return flight the next day, and by the time her mother Beth arrived on the island, a massive search was already underway. Divers went into the water. Volunteers walked the beaches. The FBI and Dutch authorities got involved. None of it produced a body or a crime scene. Van der Sloot was arrested twice. The Kalpo brothers were brought in multiple times. But every interrogation produced a different version of events, and none of it was provable. Detectives had no forensic evidence, no witnesses beyond the parking lot, and no remains. The case became an international media event, covered nightly on American cable news for months. Families canceled vacations, activists pushed for a tourism boycott of the island. And still, nothing could be proven. Aruban prosecutors closed the case in December of 2007. In January of 2012, Natalee Holloway was declared legally dead. Her family had spent nearly 7 years searching for answers that the Aruban justice system could not deliver. But Joran van der Sloot was far from finished. On May 30th, 2010, exactly 5 years to the day after Natalee vanished, He took the life of 21-year-old Stephanie Flores in a Lima, Peru hotel room. He was convicted in 2012 and sentenced to 28 years. He had also, in 2010, attempted to extort $250,000 from Beth Holloway by claiming he would reveal the location of Natalie's remains. He took the money and gave nothing in return. What kind of person tries to sell a grieving mother false information about her own daughter's body? Van der Sloot was extradited to the United States on June 8, 2023. As part of an October plea deal, he gave a proffer on October 3rd in which he described what had happened on the beach that night in Aruba 18 years earlier. He said that after Natalie rejected his advances and kneed him, he kicked her in the face, struck her in the head with a cinder block, and pushed her body into the ocean. Her remains have never been recovered. On October 18, 2023, Van der Sloot pleaded guilty to extortion and wire fraud. The judge gave him 20 years, running concurrently with his Peruvian sentence. He cannot be tried in the United States for what happened in Aruba, and Aruba's own statute of limitations complicates any prosecution there. At sentencing, Judge Anna Manasco told him directly that he had brutally ended the lives of 2 women whose only offense was refusing his advances. The Holloway disappearance consumed American media for years, sparked calls for a tourism boycott of Aruba, and turned Beth Holloway into one of the most visible missing persons advocates in the country. But for all the coverage, all the tip lines, all the underwater searches, no one ever found Natalie. The ocean kept that part of the story. As of 2026, Van der Sloot is serving his sentence concurrently in Peru. Natalie vanished on a foreign island thousands of miles from home. The 3 women at the center of the next case disappeared from their own city, blocks from people who knew their names, and spent years confined inside a house that no one ever thought to search. Michelle Knight. On a late summer day in 2002, a 21-year-old woman named Michelle Knight left her home in Cleveland, Ohio, and headed to a custody-related appointment. She was a single mother fighting to get her young son Joey back. She had no money and no support network, no family that would raise a media alarm if she disappeared. And on August 22nd or 23rd of that year, somewhere between her house and the courthouse, she got lost. A man she vaguely recognized, the father of a girl she knew, pulled up in a car and offered her a ride. His name was Ariel Castro. He brought her to his house at 2207 Seymour Avenue. She did not leave for nearly 11 years. Castro was a former school bus driver. He lived alone in a run-down 2-story home in a working-class neighborhood on Cleveland's west side. And behind the doors of that house, he had built a prison. Michelle was chained, starved, and beaten. And she was not the last. On April 21, 2003, Castro abducted 16-year-old Amanda Berry. On April 2, 2004, he took 14-year-old Gina DeJesus. All 3 women were held in the same house, hidden from a city that had mostly stopped searching for them. Michelle was held the longest, and she endured the worst of it. Castro impregnated her multiple times, and each time he beat and starved her until she miscarried. When Amanda Berry became pregnant and carried the baby to term, it was Michelle whom Castro forced to deliver the child, a girl named Jocelyn, under threat of harm to them both. In a detail that haunted investigators long after the rescue, the Cleveland Police Department had removed Michelle Knight from the FBI's database just 15 months after her initial report was filed. As far as the system was concerned, she had simply stopped being missing. Police had come to the Seymour Avenue house on more than one occasion over the years for unrelated complaints and left without discovering the women confined upstairs. For a decade, 3 abduction victims existed inside a residential neighborhood, surrounded by neighbors, and remained completely invisible. The end came on May 6, 2013. Castro left the house, and, for the first time in years, a door was not fully secured. Amanda Berry saw her chance, ran to the front of the house, and screamed through a gap in the door for someone to help. A neighbor named Charles Ramsey heard the screaming and came outside. He helped kick out the bottom panel of the storm door. Berry squeezed through, reached a phone, and called 911. She told the dispatcher her name, that she had been missing for 10 years, and that she was free. Officers arrived within minutes and found Michelle Knight and Gina DeJesus still chained inside. Castro was arrested hours later. How do 3 women vanish for a decade inside a residential neighborhood in a major American city without a single person discovering the truth? The indictment ran to 977 counts. Castro pleaded guilty on July 26, 2013 to 937 of them, including kidnapping, aggravated assault, and charges tied to the forced termination of Michelle's pregnancies through deliberate starvation and beatings. 40 redundant counts were dropped as part of the plea agreement. On August 1st, Judge Michael Russo of Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court sentenced him to life without parole, plus 1,000 years. At that hearing, Michelle Knight faced Castro directly and told him that he had stolen 11 years of her life, and that his suffering was only beginning. About a month later, on September 3, 2013, Ariel Castro took his own life in his prison cell. Michelle Knight legally changed her name to Lily Rose Lee, published a memoir titled Finding Me, married in 2016, and founded an animal rescue nonprofit. She rebuilt her life from the ground up. As of 2026, she continues her advocacy work under her chosen name. 3 women held captive for a decade in a house on a residential street. It sounds impossible until you hear about a woman in Southern California whose remains were concealed for 3 years, sealed inside a freezer in the back of a stolen truck. Denise Huber. On the night of June 2, 1991, a 23-year-old woman named Denise Huber drove home from a Morrissey concert at the Great Western Forum in Inglewood, California. She was a UC Irvine graduate with a degree in social sciences, working as a waitress and living with her parents in Newport Beach. She had gone to the concert with friends and left alone sometime after midnight. On the SR 73 freeway near Costa Mesa, her Honda Accord got a flat tire. The car was found the next morning with the hazard light still blinking and the battery dead. Denise was gone. Near the driver's side door, investigators noticed a pair of high-heeled shoes with the heels scraped raw against the pavement. The kind of marks left when a person is dragged. No blood was found at the scene, no weapon, and no witnesses who saw what happened. Denise's parents, Dennis and Ione, channeled their desperation into making sure no one forgot their daughter. They erected a massive banner along the SR 73 freeway that read, "Have you seen her?" And it became one of the most recognizable missing person appeals in Southern California during the early 90s. Dennis and Ione never stopped pushing for coverage, never stopped believing that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened to their daughter. But the weeks became months. The months became years, and the investigation had nowhere to go. There were no credible suspects and no meaningful leads. 3 years later, on July 13, 1994, a Yavapai County deputy in Arizona was looking into a stolen 24-foot rental truck parked outside a home in the small town of Dewey. The truck had been reported stolen out of Orange County, California. When the deputy opened the back, he found a chest freezer inside. And inside the freezer, handcuffed and wrapped in plastic trash bags, was the body of Denise Huber. The man living at the property was John Joseph Famularo, a house painter who had been living in Laguna Hills, California at the time of Denise's disappearance. The investigation determined that Famularo had taken Denise's life at his warehouse in Laguna Hills on the night she got the flat tire, kept her remains frozen as a trophy for approximately 3 years, and then moved the freezer across state lines to Arizona when he relocated. It was a level of premeditation and concealment that stunned even experienced investigators. The medical examiner, Dr. Ann Buchholz, found that Denise's skull had sustained at least 31 separate blows, some delivered with enough force that fragments of the weapon became embedded in bone. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. What would have happened if a retired couple in Arizona had not noticed a truck that did not belong and written down a plate number? That single phone call from Jack and Elaine Court is what solved a 3-year-old missing person case that no one in California law enforcement had been able to crack. When investigators searched Famularo's cluttered home, they found more than 100,000 items hoarded inside. Among them were boxes labeled Christmas that contained bloody weapons, including a hammer and a nail puller. They also recovered Denise's clothing, her wallet, and a set of handcuff keys. And there was one more piece of evidence that pointed to how Famularo had gotten close enough to grab her. Among his belongings was a patrol-style shirt resembling a law enforcement uniform, suggesting he may have approached Denise posing as a deputy or highway officer while she stood alone beside a disabled car on a dark freeway late at night. A young woman with a flat tire, no cell phone, and no one around. It was the kind of vulnerability a predator would have recognized instantly. On May 22, 1997, an Orange County Superior Court jury convicted Famularo of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including kidnapping and sodomy or attempted sodomy. The jury returned a death sentence. The California Supreme Court affirmed the conviction and the sentence in 2011. Every appeal Famularo has filed since then has been denied. As of 2026, he remains on death row at San Quentin, alive only because California has maintained a moratorium on executions for decades. Denise Huber was found because 2 retirees paid attention and made one phone call. In the case that follows, a college freshman vanished after a party, and it took a podcaster with a microphone and more than 2 decades of persistence to drag the truth into the open. Kristen Smart. On the night of May 24, 1996, a 19-year-old Cal Poly San Luis Obispo freshman named Kristen Smart went to an off-campus party. It was Memorial Day weekend, and by the early hours of May 25th, she had been found passed out on a neighbor's lawn. 2 fellow students, Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis, helped walk her back toward her dorm. A 3rd student, Paul Flores, joined them along the way and told the group he would make sure Kristen got the rest of the way home safely. Anderson and Davis peeled off. That was the last time anyone other than Paul Flores saw Kristen Smart alive. Flores told campus police he had walked with Kristen for a while and then watched her continue toward her own dorm alone. But Cal Poly's campus police department delayed taking a formal missing person report. And by the time a full-scale investigation launched, critical hours and days had already slipped away. In the days after the party, Flores had an unexplained black eye, and his account of the night shifted more than once. He became the prime suspect almost immediately, and for 25 years, he stayed right there. Suspected by nearly everyone, but never formally charged, Kristen was declared legally dead in 2002. Her body has never been recovered. Dozens of searches across the central coast of California turned up nothing over the years. Investigators dug up properties, scanned land with ground-penetrating radar, tested soil samples, and followed every tip that came in. At one point, Scott Peterson, who happened to be a Cal Poly student at the same time, was briefly and baselessly linked to the case before being ruled out entirely. Her parents, Stan and Denise Smart, spent decades lobbying for the investigation to stay active, appearing on news programs and pleading with anyone who had information to come forward. The case seemed destined to remain permanently open and unresolved. That changed in 2019, when a journalist and musician named Chris Lambert launched a podcast called Your Own Backyard. Lambert had grown up in San Luis Obispo County and had been drawn to the Smart case for most of his adult life. His reporting was careful and thorough. He tracked down witnesses who had never before spoken publicly, re-examined physical evidence and police records that had gathered dust for 2 decades, and brought the story back into public conversation with a force that years of police work alone had not achieved. The podcast generated fresh tips. Those tips led investigators to a property in Arroyo Grande belonging to Paul Flores's father, Ruben Flores. In March of 2021, archaeologists working alongside police found a casket-sized soil disturbance and traces of human blood beneath the deck of Ruben's home. How does a case with a known suspect sit open for 25 years until a man with a microphone and no badge breaks it wide open? Paul and Ruben Flores were both arrested in April of 2021. The trial was moved to Monterey County because of pretrial publicity. The prosecution argued that Paul had taken Kristen's life during an attempted assault in his dorm room the night she disappeared, and that Ruben had helped conceal her body afterward. 2 other women took the stand and testified that Paul Flores had drugged and assaulted them in separate incidents in later years, establishing a pattern. On October 18, 2022, a jury found Paul Flores guilty of first-degree murder. A separate jury acquitted his 81-year-old father Ruben of accessory after the fact. On March 10, 2023, Paul was sentenced to 25 years to life. His conviction was affirmed on appeal in October of 2025, and the California Supreme Court denied review in January of 2026. Searches for Kristen's remains continued into 2026, including at the home of Paul's mother, Susan. As of mid-2026, her body has still not been found. Kristen Smart's disappearance changed California law. The Kristen Smart Campus Safety Act, passed in 1998, requires university police to coordinate with local law enforcement when a student is reported missing. A rule that did not exist the weekend Kristen vanished, and whose absence is exactly what allowed the early investigation to fall apart. A podcast broke a 25-year silence and put a man behind bars. Halfway around the world, another podcast did almost the exact same thing and cracked open a case that Australian authorities had failed to resolve for more than 3 decades. Lynette Dawson. On the morning of January 9, 1982, a 33-year-old nurse and mother of 2 named Lynette Dawson was supposed to meet her family at Northbridge Baths in Sydney, Australia. She had spoken to her mother by phone the day before. Everything was normal. She never showed up. And the person who should have been the first to raise the alarm, her husband Chris, waited roughly 6 weeks before telling anyone she was gone. Chris Dawson was a former professional rugby league player for the Newtown Jets and a physical education teacher at a high school on Sydney's northern beaches. He and Lynette lived in the suburb of Bayview with their 2 young daughters. When people asked where Lynette had gone, Chris told them she had walked out on the marriage over financial problems. Later, he changed the story and said she had left to join some kind of religious group. Neither version held up. But in 1982, Australian police did not push. They treated it as a domestic walkout and moved on. What no one in authority was willing to confront at the time was already obvious to people close to the family. Chris Dawson had been grooming a teenage student at the high school where he taught, a girl identified in court records as JC, who was around 16 or 17 years old. She had been babysitting the Dawson children, and on January 10th, 1982, 2 days after Lynette was last heard from, JC moved permanently into the family home. Chris eventually married her. The case resurfaced over the decades through 2 separate coronial inquests, both of which concluded Lynette had likely been the victim of foul play. Police searched the former Dawson home in 2018, but found nothing conclusive. Lynette's family, particularly her brother Greg Sims, kept the case alive publicly, giving interviews and pressing authorities. But without a body and with Chris Dawson holding to his story, the investigation seemed permanently stalled. Then in 2018, journalist Hedley Thomas launched a podcast called The Teacher's Pet, a serialized investigation into Lynette's disappearance and the circumstances surrounding it. The series was downloaded more than 28 million times. It hit #1 in Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, and New Zealand. More importantly, it produced something that 3 decades of police work had not. New witnesses willing to speak on the record, and enough sustained public pressure to force the case back open as a formal homicide investigation. How does a man who moved a teenager into his wife's bed within 48 hours of her disappearance avoid scrutiny for 36 years? Chris Dawson was arrested in December of 2018. Because the podcast had generated extraordinary pre-trial publicity, a jury trial was ruled impractical, and the case was heard as a judge-alone proceeding in the New South Wales Supreme Court. On August 30th, 2022, Justice Ian Harrison found Chris Dawson guilty. The judge ruled that every one of Dawson's claims about being in contact with Lynette after January of 1982 was a lie, and that those lies pointed directly to consciousness of guilt. On December 2nd of that year, Dawson was sentenced to 24 years in prison with an 18-year non-parole period, meaning he cannot be considered for release before roughly 2040. Every appeal failed. The conviction was upheld on June 13, 2024, and the High Court of Australia rejected his final challenge in June of 2025. In a separate proceeding in June of 2023, Dawson was also convicted of carnal knowledge involving the student identified as AB, adding another year to his non-parole period. Lynette Dawson's body has never been found. Her brother Greg Sims has publicly asked Chris Dawson to say where she is so the family can bring her home. So far, Dawson has offered nothing. As of 2026, he remains incarcerated in New South Wales, a husband who replaced his wife with a teenager within 48 hours, a police force that filed it away for more than 30 years, and a journalist with a podcast who refused to let the silence hold. Lynette Dawson's case became one of the most significant nobody convictions in Australian legal history, and it forced an entire country to reckon with how long institutions had looked the other way. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.